Good evening, everyone, and you're welcome to the second Dolomite Conference on the Global Governance of Climate Change webinars in preparation of the conference. This webinar is a webinar where we will discuss energy transition as a lever of social justice. And the main question on the table is how can we make the climate change energy transition an agenda for all? This webinar is a part of a series of webinars, in total 3, who are just warming up the discussion before the conference that will be held from the 5th to the 8th October in Trento, the north of Italy, and this organized by Vision Think Tank and powered by Vision Think Tank in collaboration with Bocconi University of Milan and Politecnico of Milan. So today we have a group of speakers who are very qualified to discuss this, but also we have also as guest students from the university, and they will be presenting to us the findings of their research. So we will try to make a discussion between our experts and the professors that will introduce all the vision, point of view on this topic, and also the university findings about this topic. And all our speakers will try to discuss and debate about the main aspects of the problem. Well, we can say also in these days, and not only in the past years, we saw extreme weather events. The last one is very close to us in the Mediterranean Sea, happened in Derna in Libya yesterday with so many victims. And we know that 2022 recorded unprecedented droughts, forest fires, heat waves, drastically lowering the level of the Antarctic sea ice. And in Europe, now we have a heat by a drought that might be the worst in 500 years. So the World Health Organization estimated that in 2021, climate events resulted in hundreds of fatalities and affected almost 500,000 people. And the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis, the fall of the raised even more awareness on how human national security, sustainable energy sources, and climate change are closely intertwined issues. So we're trying to discuss all of these and also to know the points of view of the Vision Think Tank by Professor Francesco Grillo, who is the director of the Vision Think Tank, who's actually will join us later on. But I would like also to know more about the idea of this webinar, why we have to talk about energy transition, and why we're asking each other a question so crucial. Why is a lever for social justice? What can be brought in the agenda, and if everything brought in the agenda would be solve inequalities that actually are on the table. So I would like to first to introduce Professor Alberto Bramanti, Associate Professor of the Department of Social and Political Science of Bocconi University, will tell us something about the relation of the university with the Vision Think Tank, the topic we are going to discuss, and what are actually the findings of students on the topic.
Thank you. Thank you to Laura, and good evening to all of you. Many thanks to the co-organizer. As far as the involvement of Bocconi University as well as Politecnico of Milan with Vision on this conference, the linkages is within the new master degree courses we have opened on transformative sustainability. And of course, there are many different issues coming on in this course. And one of the most interesting things with a reference to the forthcoming conference is the involvement of a small number of students and three of them will participate also to this workshop because they have developed this introduce this very brief notes, short notes that help us in opening the discussion. So I have 5 minutes to introduce a document that you have already read. Therefore, I will try to point out the main open questions that arise and make the debate, because there are many choices in the field and we cannot do everything, not even in the conference. The short note is divided into two parts. The first part offers some starting point from vision, and we eventually wait for the intervention of Francesco. The second is the students' part, which poses 3 open issues and introduces 6 questions. I start from this second part and use the former to comment on the student point and offer insight to the debate to follow. The 3 issues arise are the idea of energy justice, the economic viability of clean energy options, and the process of creating new jobs. The idea of energy justice related to the balanced distribution of benefit and cost between different groups, different generations, and different countries. And here, the first big problem opens up. We cannot treat Europe plus a few other OECD countries and the rest of the world indistinctly. On the contrary, we need a fundamental division of labor between developed and developing countries or rich and poor countries. The second point, the affordability of clean energy option. Here the issue exists also in advanced countries. It is not a technological problem, it is a problem of cost and who pays for them. Energy inclusiveness in the global north is not different from the macro issue of the sustainability of the welfare state, which is not surprisingly going into crisis. How do you manage this problem? And finally, the issue of the labor market, jobs that are lost and new jobs created. These are necessarily medium to long-term policies. Think of how long it takes to train new human capital. But we must deal with it because social acceptability and desirability for true decarbonization primarily derive from the labor market balance. So these 3 logical joints are articulated in the final 6 questions. Cutting them short, they are time trade-off, balancing the urgency to act now with the long-term sustainability of solutions. Secondly, disparity mitigations, older people, low-income groups, women, etc. Third, engaging and participation of frontline communities. The fourth, inclusive decision-made process. That is to say, what is the right governance of energy transition? 5, the economics of clean energy. That is the affordability issue. And last, the energy transition pro-poor, pro-intensive job creation. I think that I can close here and give the floor to the discussant, asking them to comment on the ranking of the problem. So also on the ranking of the problem, what must come first and what follows, and eventually errors of omission, of course. It would also be worthwhile to start in pointing out some traces of answers to the many open points right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Alberto Bramanti. I remind you that Professor Alberto Bramanti, Associate Professor of the Department of Social and Political Science at Bocconi University in Milan. There are so many topics on this plate, we can say. Energy justice is the main one, but everything is linked, and is linked between the economy and also climate, environmental issues, but also a position, as said Professor Bramanti before, for the decision makers that should include communities and not being decisions from up to down, which is also something we have to face and understand when climate change hits mostly countries who are not in the north of the globe. So I'm glad to introduce our main speakers, and I will mention the three of them. They are Jess Scott, Professor at Hertie School, as well as visiting research fellow at the German Institution Economic Research. We have with us Petra Krylova, Global Research Director at the Social Progress Initiative. And then we have, last but not least, Mr. Abdulla Amjad, Head of Partnership at IRENA. I would like to give the floor first to Jess Scott, and then after that to Petra Krylova and Abdulla Amjad. Please, the floor is yours, Professor Jess Scott.
Laura, Alberto, thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the students for the preparatory note for this discussion. Energy justice. Clearly, we are not going to deliver anything as ambitious as an energy transition in line with a net zero global economy unless we include justice as part of the objectives. This is going to be already an ambitious and somewhat painful as well as positive process, and many justice and distributive issues are going to arise. They arise in mitigation measures, they arise in how we deal with adaptation to climate change, clearly loss and damage debate. There are intergenerational aspects, there are transfers within polities, particularly between those who have the financial resources to, for example, change their heating systems to clean ones versus those who struggle with energy costs. And there are major global transfers. Very often we hear this framed as the just transition or the just energy transition. And I think it's quite important, thinking just about energy, to realize that we have both a supply side challenge. Jobs have been mentioned, and a big focus there has been on jobs of coal miners. There are other fossil fuel workers, but in particular, large numbers of coal miners. Those numbers are large in some parts of Europe, but they are much larger, of course, in other parts of the world. But there is also a demand side dimension to this, the impact on energy consumers. I've been particularly interested in work done by groups in South Africa, looking at the commitment in the constitution to free basic electricity. Now, this is a beautiful, I think, very important concept. It's not really delivered today, but it is part of any energy transition debate. Two quick remarks. A lot of energy justice or just transitions is a discussion about finance. There will have to be financial transfers. And we have examples of this, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, or the JETPs, that were launched over the last couple of years. These are still very small, very preliminary, not very well anchored in relation either to countries' climate commitments or to their other relationships around energy. It's a start, but there are legitimately very strong critiques of these first experiments with the JETPs. But it's not just about finance, it's also about representation. And a major part of the justice of any transition is that those who are impacted are part of the discussion about the change. And interesting processes are taking place around the world, particularly in communities built around coal mining. But it's a slow process. And it's, of course, somewhat a bespoke process for each context and community. And there is a real challenge of learning, and here I look at the colleague from IRENA, Abdulla, for how we can find the most valuable lessons to accelerate that process without actually preventing representation. Because very often justice is not just about getting what you want, it's about feeling that your voice was heard, even if you are not fully in consensus with an outcome. And I think that will describe a lot about the just energy transition. Last quick remark, there is of course the dimension of energy democracy here. There are potentials with some of the new clean energy technologies. It's not the whole energy transition story, not at all, but there are potentials for very different ownership structures. And these link back to potential solutions that can help deliver some of the justice. I mentioned the South African example with the free basic electricity. This should be delivered by municipalities. Municipalities are now becoming very interested in the opportunities to install distributed rooftop solar as a way of becoming closer to being able to deliver that commitment in an affordable way without dependence on highly centralized coal power plants and national levelly owned companies and all the complexities that that has meant for that constitutional aspiration. And I'll stop there for the moment. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you so much, Professor Jessie Scott. To remind that Jessie Scott is a professor at Hertie School and also visiting research fellow at the German Institute for Economic Research. And thanks for bringing on the table important topic, how many voices should be heard before talking about justice in a general sense, and also justice related to transition and energy transition. And also thanks for bringing the conversation, one of, I think, the most fascinating topics for many reporters as me, like seeing that people in certain countries who are countries who produce a lot of energy, like Iraq, they're still demanding to their government to live with energy in their daily life, and they are completely cut off from every source of energy. This is a big, big topic if we think about so many countries who are also country in a big development. So I will give the floor now to Petra Krylova, Global Research Director at the Social Progress Initiative, and the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Laura, for the kind introduction, and many thanks to the entire team for all of your work for making this happen, and the forthcoming conference as well. First and foremost, congratulations to the students for putting together a very comprehensive draft on a very complex issue. Throughout the paper, you've highlighted some of the key issues in this debate. How can social justice and energy transition be put together? Can we eliminate the trade-off between sustainable growth and social justice? Climate change and energy transition are still not on top of the agenda, including public perception surveys. I will touch upon a couple of them, but before I do so, let me give a disclaimer that I am an optimist who likes to focus on best cases and look for solutions to problems. And the answers to many of these questions are not simple. If they were, most likely we wouldn't be here today. But I think there are ingredients to the recipe that we know work. And there are countries that perform better than others, which can lead the way. So allow me to add a few additional pieces to the puzzle. And if I may ask the team to share the few slides that I prepared, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much. Last year, with colleagues at the European University Institute, we looked at the relationship between people's awareness of climate change and the country's performance in governance. And what we find is a strong and significant relationship. This means that the data indicate that countries which show better performance on governance also show higher levels of people's awareness of climate change. This might reflect a number of things. Better governed countries are likely to have easier access to knowledge. Their governments might not be censoring information or discrediting scientific findings compared to other countries. Also, these countries might have incorporated some aspects of climate change in their apparatus, in education, environmental impact assessments, etc. So I think that's a piece of good news. However, this relationship changes significantly when we look at risk perceptions. And here we see essentially no relationship for any domain of governance that we looked into, and the perception of risk. And this lack of association between awareness and perception poses a very important question for all of us, climate advocates, policymakers. Why does greater awareness not translate into greater perception of risks associated with climate change? If we may go on the second slide. At Social Progress Imperative, we construct the Social Progress Index, which measures countries' performance on social and environmental outcome indicators. The index is purely based on social and environmental indicators, not including economic indicators, not because we wouldn't consider them as important, but because the exclusion of the indicators enables us to better understand the relationship between the social performance of countries or generating well-being for their peoples and economic performance of countries. And based on the Social Progress Index, we developed an indicator which looks at the ratio of consumption-based CO2 emission per capita and the Social Progress Index. This shows higher the ratio, the less carbon efficient a country is in generating social progress. And here we see an opportunity to learn from the top countries on what we call the just transition score, as they outperform, in many cases, the wealthiest nations in the world with just a fraction of resources. You see the top performers, the highest ranked countries on just transition are certainly not the wealthiest ones. The lowest ranked countries, on the contrary, often are some of the wealthiest countries in the world. But we also find some positive news, even with the lowest performers, and that is we have seen some of the greatest improvements in just transition score for some of these countries. And thirdly, just a little word of caution. If I may ask for the third slide. The word of caution that we should be very cautious about not narrowing down just transition to only focus narrowly on job creation and employment. Just transition really needs to holistically and comprehensively ensure societal benefits across different segments of populations, but also different components of what we would call social progress. So do people have enough food to eat? Can they drink water and keep themselves clean without getting sick? Do they have adequate housing? Do they feel safe? Do they have access to basic knowledge, information? Can they live long and healthy lives? Do they live in an environment that supports societal well-being? Are their rights and freedoms protected? is no one excluded from the opportunity to be a contributing member to the society? And can they access the world's most advanced knowledge? And I think only by ensuring the just transition focuses on all of these aspects of well-being, we really ensure the just transition delivers for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Petra Krylova. I remind she's a Global Research Director at the Social Progress Initiative. And thank you for pointing out just as an answer to the main question, how can we make the climate change an agenda for all if there's no rule of law in the countries, if there's no accountability, if there's no inclusiveness for all the social groups, if there are not so many possibilities of evolution opportunities, and also clear policies about protecting the environment where people and communities live. So this is a big question on the table. And I would like to give the floor now to Abdulla Amjad, that I remind you is the head of partnership at IRENA. The floor is yours, Ms. Amjad.
Yeah, and first of all, let me also thank you, the organizers, the Vision Think Tank, as well as you, Laura, for moderating this session, but not least the students who have kind of consolidated this very interesting concept. Again, like, let me just give the context. I think we are all kind of living in a fear of threat posed by the adverse impact of climate change. There's no doubt about it. No one is immune about it. No one is immune from these impacts. So we are all in the same boat. The fact that, again, like, including the social justice, I think one has to also recognize that we cannot leave anyone behind. It has to be a fair, ambitious, and inclusive just transition for climate action. If you try to include everyone across the globe, no matter how poor, how vulnerable you are, you have to try and treat them equally as much as possible. You cannot leave any societies behind. That is the biggest challenge that we have been confronted with. Because again, like, it's about how do you balance about sustainable consumption and production. There is a strong link between sustainable consumption and production, because the more that you get richer, the more that you want more. But you don't look behind those who cannot eat one meal a day, and those who doesn't have a light. So, and those who are suffering because their vaccines have no place for refrigeration. So if you try to light, if you try to get the energy access to the most poor, the last mileage people, you're going to resolve an incredible amount of issues relating to social justice, climate action, and eradicate poverty. I think we tend to forget about eradicating poverty. If you try to bring that context, eradicating poverty, you are kind of killing more than a dozen of birds in one stone. So this is where I think we are kind of, we keep tend to forget about these things. So in any society, if you look at any society or any state or any community, whether it's poor, rich, the most important thing is how can it be justice, all inclusive, no one is left behind. So this is where I think the fundamental is, again, like the access to adequate, predictable financing for energy transition for climate action. If you try to address that, I think you are going to resolve multitude of problems relating to climate change, justice, and eradicate poverty. I think this is where I think that we need to start kind of collecting as a collective responsibility. Again, like, we are all have differentiated responsibilities. If we try to take our own responsibilities and try to address an equitable manner, then I think we wouldn't have been in the crazy mess with regard to climate impacts, and that we are all kind of being hit day and night, and we all experiencing that, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in the small islands, whether it's in the Caribbean, we are all in the same boat. So let's start changing the narrative of international cooperation. And again, for just transition, because the energy infrastructure that was built was not fit for purpose. Because now you cannot have the energy transition as we did after the Second World War, because that was meant to be based on fossil fuels. So we need to industrialize to the needs of the current, status. So this is where we need to think. Another angle is that one, and the new narrative for international cooperation. Because again, like I'm sure, you are all aware, the financial institutions were not meant to, when there was no climate change, because the financial institutions were created to cater for the infrastructure that was not meant to withstand or be resilient to the impacts of climate change. So now you have to think that way, because the climate will not go to where, to the conditions of the banks. The banks has to, or the financial institutions has to change as per the changes of climate change. So those are the few cents that that's from my side. I'm happy to respond to any other further questions. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Abdulla Amjad. I remind you that he's the head of the partnership at IRENA. And thank you for basically saying that no one in this world should be left behind, talking about climate change. And talking about climate change, we have to change the narrative of international cooperation, starting from the financial stakeholders. And also we have to remind that the consequences of climate change actually are not the same everywhere in the world. Just to say, a couple of facts, what we are seeing now in Mediterranean Sea, like floods happening, it's happening quite every day in Bangladesh, for example, and these people are really neglected by their government and also sometimes by the international community. So before giving the floor to the students of Bocconi University and introducing them and listening to their findings and knowing they have questions, I would like to introduce you Francesco Grillo. Professor Francesco Grillo is director of the Vision think tank, who arrived online a few minutes ago. And I would like to give him the floor to tell us more about these initiatives, the webinars, this important topic, and how this topic will fit in the next conference, Dolomite Conference in Trento.
Thank you very much, Laura. I had a rocky start to the Dolomite Conference on Global Governance of Climate Change. I'm now at Politecnico di Milano, so probably not very far from Olivia, Leo, and Chandra, to whom I will immediately give the word. I just need to thank again Laura to chair. Laura is very close to the very question of justice. She is very close to Yemen. This is a very war-torn country. Thanks to Jesse, to Petra for your very interesting insight. Big hug to Amjad, who probably has mentioned that beyond being at IRENA and at the IPCC, he's from Maldives. I wrote a column on Maldives. Maldives, in the imagination of European tourists, is a sort of very luxurious paradise. But it is a paradise that we are literally losing because it's one of those islands that we risk to lose. So it's a sort of, my column on Maldives was titled Lost Paradise, and I really hope to change the narrative on Maldives too, with you, Amjad. Thanks, Alberto, to try to pack very many arguments in one relatively short paper. And let me give the floor to the students, probably Olivia or Leo or Chandra. It's your turn. Thank you so much again.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay, good.
Yeah, we hear you, and yeah, we give the floor to you. I remind to our followers that Chandra, Carrara, Olivia, Fructus, and Leo Ceretti are all three students of the Master in Transformative Sustainability, and they wrote this paper on the topic we are discussing right now. So I would like to ask you to tell us more about your paper and also how the work is proceeding right now.
Well, I mean, I think we're upon receiving the feedback from the three of you, maybe later, we can finalize the papers and we can still keep discussion and not being like exclusive to this webinar. Do you have anything to add, Olivia?
No, maybe I wanted to thank you for the comments that you made, and also thank to Alberto that helped us building this paper. It's a super complex and super sensitive topic, but I think it's really important, and yeah, it was really interesting to work on it, and looking forward to continue to deepen the knowledge on the subject.
Yeah.
Do we have also Chandra with us?
She's doing an internship and she got stuck at work, so no, unfortunately she will not be joining tonight.
Okay, so maybe you will have her questions, or she will have feedback as you will have now. And I would ask you, Leo Ceretti and Olivia Fructus, if you have any questions for our speakers, actually, on the topic, of course, of energy justice, but can we answer to the main question, how can we make the climate change an agenda for all? I know that you already answer in somehow in your paper, but I would like to can extend the topic and the questions to our three main speakers.
Yes, I think it's not really a question because I think we don't have an answer for now. But regarding the politics of different countries, so some are democracies, some are well-less democracies, how can we figure a way to tackle the different political situation to be able to not forget anyone on this transition and to make it just? Maybe
Yeah, just add on to what she said. I mean, like Alberto said, there are different levels that we have to also consider. And like Olivia said, there are different countries, and like we have petrostates that like have national oil companies, and also we have like the more country level, the different socioeconomic perspectives. So I was just imagining what kind of discussions we could be having at the conference, like whether that's like a very concrete policy level discussion or a bit more like broadly at the global level. But yeah, I'm just excited to start a conversation.
Sure. Thank you, Leo. And Olivia, I would like to forward the question to our speakers. I think we saw here a route. We said many important things we can, like summarizing in bullet points. No one should be left behind. It's really important to have a look on certain countries who are the countries actually that use more are extractive countries. We have to take care about the rule of law, the accountability. We have to think about that climate change means also adaptation, but also loss and damage debate about what is already happened and what is already done or not done. So I would like to go more into this topic, stimulated by the questions of our great students. So I would like to give the floor to each one of our speakers, starting from Jesse Scott and then Petra, Krylova, and of course, last but not least, Abdulla Amjad.
Well, thank you to the students. I think you put your finger on something. Is this a discussion about policies or politics? Of course, it's both. Mostly it's politics today. There are some parts of the world where concrete policies are being developed, notably in Europe. And they're very interesting and they're very, very important to the politics of agreement within the European Union for action on climate change. Just one example, the Social Climate Fund, which is part of the current Fit for 55 package of climate and energy transition measures at the European Union level. The challenge is that a model that works in Europe is not very transferable to Pakistan, Kenya, Indonesia, Chile, each of which is very different. So then you get into both a question of policies that suit circumstances and politics between different parts of the world. And here we all know that the historic emissions are from what is today the rich West. Then we have today's mega emitters, particularly China, but India's up there too because of its sheer size. And then we have tomorrow's risk emitters. I'll give you Pakistan as one example, 6th biggest population on Earth, growing incredibly fast, with its own internal energy justice issues. There's actually enough energy for everybody in Pakistan. It's just, it's not reaching everybody in Pakistan. These then become highly political issues, not least because we are sort of having people sitting in Berlin trying to have conversations with people sitting in other countries who perhaps do not have a great history of interference from Europe. And we are talking about transfers. Ultimately, that is going to mean European taxpayers will be contributing to investments in better outcomes in countries outside Europe. And I don't hear politicians wishing to begin to manage that political debate today. One more dimension is, of course, what we mean by justice or just transition. And if you look at just transition in the energy sector, there's the sort of the International Labour Organization definition, which is really important, but is essentially about fair arrangements for workers, particularly employee workers, formal workers, in sunsetting industries. And then there is just transition, as friends of mine in the African Coal Network would hear it, which is a much bigger topic, where we are actually looking at reparations for colonialism as part of the scope. Now, if everybody's using the same term but meaning radically different things in a highly politicized environment where the policies are still very nascent, as you can imagine, this is a challenging, messy area. And it's one where it's incredibly valuable that we do a lot of listening to one another. And in order to not make that just a generic discussion, it can be helpful, I think, to start to look for not necessarily policy success stories, but policy problem descriptions from around the world. And that's one of the things I'd like to see us be able to do at the conference, is to select some contrasting examples and explore the issues that those then concretize.
Thank you, Jessie Scott. Of course, it's very difficult to make good policies if politicians don't know very well places and things they're talking about, even though they have very good intentions. And Petra, Krylova, how we can build kind of chassis on this topic, but in a real way, in a very practical way for the next years.
I will actually build on Jessie's last point of best cases, and considering what the students have raised, level of democracy in countries, and how can we reconcile that and really ensure just transition is delivered, leaving no one behind. We find different levels of performance on all aspects at different levels of governance or democracy. There might be countries that are closer to one another in terms of their approach to democracy, that will be much more likely and willing to learn from one another than to learn from countries that are at the other end of the spectrum. But we still need to look for those best cases to really make that peer pressure. We really must ensure this isn't a race to the bottom, but this is the race to the top. And within each group or cluster of countries, regardless of how that is defined, we really look for the best cases that can be emulated, even though, as Jessie very rightly pointed out, what is done in the context of the European Union might not be easily replicable elsewhere, and context really matters. But even when context really matters, I think we can still aim for best practices and aiming for solutions, rather than searching for reasons why things will not work.
Thank you, Petra, Krylova. So let's look for best practices everywhere in the world, not only in Europe, that wants to be basically a leader in this transition and in social justice on this regard. And Abdulla, Amjad, you already said no one should be left behind, but there's a lot to do on the side of financial sectors, on the points of view of financial companies, and this is a crucial aspect of the issue, right?
Certainly, I think Jessica mentioned about the collective responsibility, but again, like I wanted to go back to one of the fundamental principles, that is common but differentiated responsibilities with respective capabilities. I think, again, like, there is the history behind it, the historical responsibilities. That is what we call the developed countries. That's the industrialized countries, so-called. And again, like, there is the emerging economies. One has to also recognize the emerging economies. And then you have the rest of the developing world, including the least developed countries and the small islands, which are illiquid and which does not have the adequate capacity and the investment, conducive investment. So again, like, people often go where you can get return on investment. Let's be honest. I mean, that's where the economics works, how the economics work. But if you look at the kind of the justice issues. This is where the justice comes, and where you cannot leave anyone behind. Because if you look at the context of the least developed countries or small islands, there is no economies of scale. So people are reluctant. So is it fair? So how do we make that kind of linkages? So this is where I think you need to bring the context of, loss and damage. This is where I think the talk about loss and damage. Again, like no one is trying to kind of sue someone who has done damage or something. I think it's more about solidarity. It's about solidarity. It's about, collective responsibility. I don't think liability is an issue with regard to that, because I don't think people are asking for compensation. It's not about compensation. It's about solidarity, because there are issues that you cannot revert back. Unavoidable losses of the cultures, the people, the places. So that's where the new financial architecture has to kind of fit for the purpose to cater the current realities of the impacts of climate change. So with that, I know that we are almost running out of time. Thank you very much once again. Over to you.
Thank you, Abdulla, Amjad, for talking about solidarity. And actually, in these 3-4 days, we saw a lot about it. Earthquake in Morocco and a flood in Libya, here in the Mediterranean, and a lot of people did for Moroccans and what happened there, but we're not seeing actually the same empathy for the victims of the floods in Libya. But we are all interconnected in this world, and everything happens on one side of the Mediterranean Sea. It's happening also, it's going to happen on the other side, because this is the global system where we are immersed. So I know that we can continue with this amazing discussion and in Trento in the next Dolomite conference. That's why also I want to give the floor at the end to our host, Professor Francesco Grillo, who is the director of the Vision think tank. I will give you the floor, and thank you, Francesco, also for inviting me to chair this beautiful panel.
Thank you very much, Laura. Let me say also a couple of things in terms of method, because this is the very first webinar or webinars that we are having on the road to the Dolomite conference. I would say that we should push even further in at least 2 directions. If Alberto is happy with that. Number one is I think we need to probably give a contribution to better define the problems that we are talking about. Amjad, Petra, and Jesse were very right. We, especially when we talk about justice, we tend to have many very rhetoric declarations, especially after the big multilateral meetings like the G20. But yes, we probably want to define better what we're really talking about. Are we talking about policies, or are we talking about politics? These are two very different things. Are we talking about justice, injustice among generations? Are we talking about injustice among different countries, or among different segments of people within the same countries? I mean, I would try to push forward a little bit the problem setting, and number 2, the problem solving. We cannot save the world with the Dolomite conference, at least with the second edition of the Dolomite conference. Probably in time we will be much more influential. But it would be really good to have a couple of ideas, something concrete, something pragmatic and yet visionary that can sort of indicate a direction, and can be of added value to our two quote-unquote clients. Number one, the international organization, also national governments that are sort of paralyzed into a number of gridlocks. And number two, the public opinions, the debate, because also the debate is quite sort of confused. Sometimes we will have many media, global media in Trento and Bolzano. So let's take the opportunity to probably even push forward some ideas. One very small thing on justice. Let's not forget that energy justice. Let's not forget one thing which seems quite certain: a world where the energy transition is accomplished, is finished, where just to make a stupid example, the entire fossil is replaced with renewables. It is a world that technically is more just, because if everybody can produce its own energy, if every family can even sell the energy to other communities and to the system, it's a world where you have less concentration of energy vis-a-vis nowadays, and much likely less inequalities. The problem is how to make the transition. And probably one method to have ideas is to use the added value of a transition accomplished to finance the investment that we are doing, we need to do today. Having said that, let's go very quickly to the 4 webinars. Today was Energy Transition as a Lever for Social Justice. The next one will be the Beyond ESG, Measure Less, Measure Better. So which are the mechanisms for better steering private investments towards sustainability. I think companies will be especially, and banks will be especially interested to this very one. Then on the 19th of September, we will have a webinar on cities. We sort of are focusing with, again, the students of Politecnico and Bocconi on the very question of the last mile. And we are even focusing on the delivery of food. So it's a specific case within the much wider question of neutral cities. And then to finish, on the 26th, we will have the climate change. Climate change as a trigger for what we call here global democracy. Global democracy is not a new concept, it's a sort of chimera. But at least here we are talking about some mechanism to better engage citizens into global decision making, and especially young citizens who are the ones that are will suffer the most of the injustice of a not fast enough energy transition. So having said that, again, I'm sorry that today I was late because of a rocky start and because of the train from Politecnico di Milano. I went to Ceretti instead of going to Milano. But thank you again to everybody. And we are very much looking forward to see you in Milano. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks
Good
to
evening.
you.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye bye.